Xcom 2 is a game about humanity's final attempt to reclaim Earth from an overwhelmingly powerful alien occupation, and in an attempt that I can only assume was made after every human applicant either died or failed a background check, Xcom has apparently decided that the best way to win that war is by hiring the aliens instead. So today, we're attempting to beat Xcom using an all-alien squad. Now technically, the explanation here is that these are defectors, former enemy operatives who have joined the resistance in humanity's hour of need. Which is a nice story and very marketable, but the longer this run went on, the more I started to suspect these aliens didn't switch sides because they had a moral awakening. I think they just used to work for complete idiots. Instead of carefully evaluating these former invaders, Xcom immediately throws them into combat under what appears to be a barely functional rehabilitation program. So over the course of this campaign, we're going to learn why they defected, whether they can function as a military unit together, and whether humanity's survival should really be resting in the hands of a group who just tried to kill us last week. There are a few restrictions though. I can only use units that are already in my barracks at the start of the campaign, so I couldn't just keep adding new soldiers to the roster whenever I felt like it. There will be one exception later, but when we get there, I'll explain why that thing absolutely could not be used to ruin more than a single mission. Additionally, because I believe this campaign wasn't unstable enough yet, we're going to be playing on the hardest difficulty, meaning the first mission immediately had something to prove. Now, normally, the campaign begins with Operation Gatecrasher, but in this run, Gatecrasher had to be skipped because of a bug that replaced every alien model with human ones, while also keeping the alien animations intact. Meaning, the mission looked less like XCOM and more like a government-funded body horror experiment. So instead, our first real mission starts here, and immediately our mutant can be seen staring into a pile of trash. And that was reassuring because nothing says humanity's last hope like losing your strongest soldier to recycling curiosity. The program also got off to a strong start when an enemy sectoid immediately mind-controlled my sectoid 3 minutes into the mission, which was a useful reminder that even though some of these aliens now worked for me, the rest were still taking this invasion thing very seriously. We free him, and fortunately, the Psy Zombie helped stabilize things slightly because at first glance, it looks like a disposable summon, but in practice, it behaves more like a mimic beacon that can fight back, meaning I could send it forward to activate pods safely and occasionally let it participate in saving the Earth. Even with that advantage, I still nearly ran out of time because I was playing too cautiously, so I eventually had to sprint to the objective just to finish the mission despite commanding a squad of literal alien war criminals. Sectoids also can't hack terminals properly, but it turns out if you just press enter repeatedly with enough confidence, the game will eventually let you pass. After the mission, the Vipers received a bonus to their weapon damage, meaning injecting paralyzing poison directly into someone's bloodstream was apparently not considered enough of an advantage on its own. Around the same time, I discovered that the Lost can still attack while being bound by a Viper, suggesting that suffocation is not enough to override their commitment to workplace violence. Instead of faction soldiers, I replaced those roles with alien equivalents, meaning Spectres would be unlocked in the same way as starting with the Reaper, while Codex and Andromedons would be unlocked later. And naturally, the first thing the Spectre did was immediately get spotted because I assumed it had stealth capabilities that it did not actually possess. The first retaliation mission clarified something else, when a priest used Holy Warrior on a basic trooper, and this was one of the first moments in the run where I realized the people my defectors had previously been taking orders from may not be sending their best. Unfortunately, when the Warlock showed up, he mind-scorched my mutant into a full-body T-pose, mind-controlled my officer, and had that same officer shoot my Viper immediately. So that essentially forced me to let him extract knowledge because quite frankly, he was putting belt to ass. Mind control also worked unusually well on the aliens, which story-wise I chose to interpret as them still being partially connected to the psionic network, meaning while humanity had spent years studying alien biology, I had somehow assembled a workforce that could still be factory reset by bad thoughts. We stabilized the mission, and 2 soldiers were wounded for over 30 days, and that feels excessive, especially when one of them is a Spectre, because surely we could have put him back together faster than that, considering he's made out of Legos. On the strategic layer, I prioritized scientists first because I wanted to complete research as quickly as possible, and I was extremely curious to see how they would react once they realized the Avenger was now staffed by the same species they had presumably been spending years dissecting.
Who the fuck is that?
I then got my first Andromedon and immediately realized this thing was less of a soldier and more of an industrial accident with a gun, because it came with a giant health pool, built-in armor, and enough mass to remove most forms of cover simply by walking near them. Watching it enter a mission felt less like deploying a unit and more like filing an insurance claim. Oh my god. The next mission contained nothing but Faceless and one Stun Lancer, which already sounds a bit strange, but got worse when they all grouped together at the back of the map like they were waiting for brunch reservations. At that point, they stopped looking like a group of enemies and started looking like the source of all Advent beef products. So if you've ever eaten a burger in Xcom and thought the texture seemed slightly off, there's a good chance that Kayla poisoned the source that afternoon. The Hunter then appeared, and after we cleaned up all the Faceless, he immediately shoots one of my zombies twice, and that raised an important question about whether the game understood something about these zombies that I simply didn't. But we killed him anyways, and by the end of the early game, the aliens were strong, the enemy was somehow worse, and XCOM's decision to put former invaders on the active roster was somehow beginning to look less experimental and more statistically irresponsible.
His big ass.
The next mission introduced my first codex, and very quickly established that this unit was going to become one of the most dangerous tools in the entire run. Once per turn, the codex can teleport anywhere on the map, so naturally I used that responsibility to blink directly behind an enemy Viper and remove it from existence. This was especially reassuring because earlier in that same mission I had already used it to shoot a fuel tanker, which exploded and somehow left the purifier frozen in mid-air like the physics engine quietly decided it was no longer responsible for him. After that, we unlocked improved magnetic weapons, but to be honest, at this point, the real power spike clearly came from commanding a soldier capable of violating geography once per turn. Eastern Europe also provided improved weapon modification bonuses, and that made sense because if any region understands how to optimize weapon performance under stressful conditions, it's them. Another mission then produced one of the stranger visual moments in the entire run, when an enemy Viper ran up to my Viper and used Bind, only for the animation to make it look like they were both binding each other at the same time. They both briefly transformed the battlefield from an active combat zone into what appeared to be an extremely emotional disagreement between two former co-workers who were no longer sure which side HR worked for. Around that same stretch, a Stun Lancer then attempted to melee a Muton, despite years of working alongside them, suggesting Advent training manuals may not include a section titled "Do Not Punch Mutons."
I'm sorry.
That mission also nearly got one of my sectoids killed after I moved a Viper close to him, prompting a purifier to throw a grenade that set the sectoid on fire. This was bad, not only because he was now burning alive, but because sectoids can't use the hunker down feature, meaning the mission had very suddenly turned into an evacuation operation involving a unit whose defensive options now largely consisted of continuing to scream internally. While we were trying to pull him out to safety, however, we activated the Warlock, which meant the rescue attempt immediately escalated into one of the stranger chosen encounters in the run. Because instead of taking the fight normally, I ended up hiding the rest of the squad and letting the Spectre handle him almost entirely by itself. After evacuating the sectoid, I threw a mimic beacon to buy time, and a priest that he summoned obligingly shot, only for the Warlock to then teleport him closer to us anyways, as though he had personally decided that cowardice was no longer an acceptable career path. Once the priest was removed though, we then brought our Spectre into a position that was behind and above the Warlock to line up a shot. We hit him, shredding his armor, making him go into Overwatch. After that, we line up a shot, and we hit him, shredding his armor and making him go into Overwatch. Next, we line up a shot, hitting him, shredding his armor, and making him... Wait a minute, that can't be in the script.
How much can you see with those shotting gun of yours?
For more than 3 turns in a row, we trapped the Warlock in what seems to be an Izanami loop. Same move, same outcome, same turn. He never learned. He seemed to think he was making the optimal decision each time, largely because he couldn't properly locate the rest of my team, wasn't technically being flanked, and crucially, had not yet adjusted to the fact that the Spectre was a robot and therefore outside the normal emotional economy of fear. Eventually, we got him low enough to try and finish him with the rest of the team, but not quite low enough to do it cleanly. Due to us shooting the same spot over and over, his cover eventually broke and he ran through my Viper's poison trying to reposition, spawned 2 different enemies for support, and immediately watched those enemies die. He then was left 1 shot from death himself and we happily supplied. So, by the time the mission ended, the sectoid was alive, the VIP made it out safely, and one of the chosen had just spent several turns trapped inside one of the strongest genjutsu in the Naruto universe. Immediately after that, the officer unlocked the ability to summon Advent troopers, and this is the point where the squad stopped resembling a resistance team and started resembling a small but extremely enthusiastic regional office. The whole roster was becoming increasingly difficult to explain in normal military terms, and that feeling only got stronger once the bar scene started kicking in, because almost immediately after being burned alive, the sectoid and his mutant friend could later be seen drinking together back on the ship like they had just finished filing paperwork instead of surviving a supernatural firefight. The Andromedon also hit Captain around this point and unlocked this acid bomb, and I'm pretty sure this thing now violates the Geneva Conventions. The Codex, meanwhile, kept proving that it was less of a soldier and more of a loophole, because on one mission, with only 3 turns left to complete the objective, I decided to test whether its teleport was strong enough to go directly to the target and finish the mission on the spot. It was, and we did. And while I don't abuse this because it's obviously absurd, the experiment did confirm that by mid-game, the aliens had begun solving problems in ways the campaign had clearly not been budgeted for. Unfortunately, while the tactical side of the run was thriving, the strategy layer was beginning to collapse. The Resistance Ring kept offering me faction soldier recruitment missions that I was refusing on principle, and the whole system effectively clogged itself, which meant fewer opportunities to reduce the Avatar project, and eventually the timer started for real. And at that point, with only 24 days left and no clean route to stop it, the campaign started getting serious. The Black Site mission was next, and it immediately produced one of the more interesting interactions in this run. Under normal circumstances, priests are usually allowed to cheat death once through sustain, briefly surviving a killing blow like the game is trying to reward them for being annoying. What I hadn't realized was that if a priest is being bound by a viper, when sustain triggers, the bind continues and it dies anyways, showcasing that the viper's grip apparently outranks divine intervention. This mission also gave me another chance to test the boundaries of the officer's summoning privileges, because at one point I accidentally rolled one of my own troopers. This did feel like a slight step backwards from a command structure standpoint, mainly because it suggested that while the aliens did switch uniforms, they were still negotiating the lives of anything that looked remotely human. We then reached the Warlock later on in that mission, and his cover choices throughout the fight were so poor, it stopped looking like strategy and started looking like a cry for help. This man was trying to hide 8 feet of hairline receding ego behind what amounted to decorative landscaping. He was already no match for the Spectre on its own, so once the full alien team got involved, the outcome was less of a duel and more of a beatdown. Finishing the mission bought us time by reducing the Avatar project, which was ideal, and that was really the point where another realization started setting in. The more I watched these units operate under my command, the more I started to understand why the Elders wanted the commander back so badly, because whatever they had been doing with the alien forces before clearly wasn't working. Under my direction, these same units were stronger, more organized, and way more effective at solving problems, even if some of those problems had technically been created by us moments earlier. The commander, it would seem, does not simply lead the alien forces, he unlocks their full tactical potential, which is a very dramatic sentence and significantly less impressive once accompanied by footage of me accidentally blowing up my own mans. Not long after that, we finally built resistance comms. This allowed us to begin expanding outward and, in a sense, informing the rest of the world that Xcom was now accepting applications from species that had been previously trying to conquer it. But before we could make proper contact, a mission appeared to recover some important Advent data, and almost immediately, one of my Vipers accidentally killed a civilian. Not directly, mind you. I fired a poison cloud into a group of enemy soldiers, carefully placing it so that the civilian wouldn't actually be touched by the initial spit, only for the man to take one look at the Viper, panic, sprint directly into the cloud on his own, and then die anyways. Which from a public relations standpoint was not ideal, but did suggest that the civilian evacuation procedures were still very much a work in progress. The mission itself then became much more serious because I made a fairly catastrophic oversight before it even started. Only officers can interact with the objective, and I had not brought an officer, so what should have been a routine recovery mission quickly turned into a countdown towards complete embarrassment. As the timer ticked down and the possibility of failing a mission entirely due to my own negligence became increasingly real, I remembered that earlier in the campaign, one of my side zombies had been able to interact with the supply crate. So, with no officer available and very few remaining good decisions left, I summoned one and sent it over to the objective, and thankfully, it worked. And this is when I finally understood why the enemy was so obsessed with shooting the zombies. Not the Andromedons, not the Vipers, not the Codex who can teleport anywhere they please, but the zombies, because apparently they were one of the single biggest threats in the entire operation. Back on the ship, a mutant could be seen doing push-ups, and I appreciate this as a visual reminder that while humanity was trying to decode alien tactical behavior through captured data, the real answer was apparently just calisthenics. This was around the point where the campaign began explaining more of what was happening behind the scenes through one of the chips recovered from the Advent officer. Tygan reveals that the network is used to distribute orders and improve the tactical readiness of their forces, and in hindsight this actually explains quite a lot, because if the enemy had spent years relying on centralized psionic infrastructure just to maintain basic battlefield competence, then suddenly removing the commander from the equation may well have left the rest of them operating approximately at the same level as the department manager who just quit mid-shift. Which from a story perspective made our aliens look less like moral converts and a little more like employees who just left the company after upper management imploded. We also got our first armor upgrade around this time. This finally pushed a lot of the aliens out of one-shot territory, and this was a huge practical improvement because up until that point, the squad had been surviving largely through brute effectiveness and a reckless disregard for future consequences. Before going any further though, I decided to nerf the Codex and the Spectre, because both had been given pack-a-punch weapons through their configuration files and were becoming a little too comfortable. So I went back into the INI files and performed what I can only describe as the world's least interesting balance patch, changing infinite ammo from true to false, and quietly pretending that I had restored order rather than admitting that the modded aliens were beginning to outgrow the rules of the campaign entirely. Another VIP mission followed, this time one where the target's guard, a mutant, had chose to position himself next to a gas pump, which felt like a tactical decision made by someone who at best skimmed the training manual. Eventually we subdued the VIP because he supposedly had valuable information, and for a brief moment I entertained the idea that perhaps he knew something important about our team, the network, or the broader collapse of the alien hierarchy. Unfortunately, when we attempted to extract him next turn, he died due to a bug.
-15, the target is down. Repeat, we've lost the package.
Why did he die?
I reloaded the save. I tried extracting everyone. I even used the command console to try and force the mission win, and nothing worked. I explored every possible situation outside of performing a seance, and none of it worked. So in the end, although the mission itself wasn't technically a failure, the VIP still took his secrets to the grave, leaving us with only the uncomfortable sense that we had just been denied plot development by software negligence. This all happened while the Warlock continued to gain intel on us, the Avatar project began climbing again, and the campaign gently reminded me that no matter how efficient the squad looked on the battlefield, poor strategy layer management could still send the entire world directly into the void. So with 15 days left and very little room for error, we made contact with another region where we entered the assassin's territory and immediately launched an assault on the nearest Advent facility. This is where the Viper King appeared for the first time, and in a run already framed around alien defectors and integration efforts, it was difficult not to appreciate the fact that one of Dr. Valen's earlier attempts at improving alien biology had resulted in something that looked less like an enhancement and more like something you would fight in a Monster Hunter game. What followed, however, was one of the cleanest ruler encounters I've ever had, largely because we managed to stay out of its line of sight as much as possible. We opened with poison, used stasis to prevent retaliation while we cleaned up the first wave of enemies, and generally kept the entire fight operating on our terms, right up until I got too comfortable, raised a side zombie too close to the facility, and activated another pod by accident. And I suspect around this point our aliens started questioning whether Save the Earth was really the right long-term investment for them. Thankfully, a purifier in the new pod died instantly, which was a useful reminder that even though Advent may have solved most diseases, they somehow still never got around to giving some of their troops any armor. The mech remained more of a problem, so I sent one of the officers summoned troopers forward to get some damage in and die a hero's death. And needless to say, his contract ended exactly as expected. From there, the fight with the Viper King continued unraveling in our favor. We picked off one of the remaining enemies, avoided triggering retaliation where possible, shredded his armor, watched him miss a tongue pull on the Muton, and generally reduced him to the point where one final shot from the sectoid forced him to flee. And honestly, for a first encounter, it was almost suspiciously clean. The aliens had not only survived, they had performed like specialists. Destroying the facility pushed the Avatar project back once again, but in doing so also angered the assassin, who appeared on the next mission and immediately reduced me to the emotional equivalent of wet cardboard. This was mostly because I had brought a sectoid, and a sectoid can take a physical hit about as well as a Chansey taking a close combat from a max attack adamant nature Lucario. Damn! So the moment she appeared, I became convinced she was specifically hunting him. I pulled back, moved the team forward, threw a battle scanner, and found nothing. She then says,
"Where will you possibly run that I cannot find you?"
and I spent the next several turns becoming progressively less stable as she refused to show herself. At that point, the other enemies on the map had become a secondary issue. This was no longer a tactical engagement. This was a psychological operation designed specifically to drain my will bar in real life. Eventually, after enough of this, I gave up on slow play and sent the Codex all the way to the edge of the map in a Hail Mary attempt to reveal her. At which point it became clear that the assassin had not been enacting some brilliant ambush plan, so much as simply moving back and forth in the same spot and trolling me over the comms. We shot her with the Codex, she dazed two teammates with the Harbor Wave, and then on a following turn, after hitting one of my Vipers and retreating again, we tracked her down. My sectoid then moved aggressively close because I believed correctly that I might be able to kill her then and there, and the grenade he threw blew her through the floor. Somehow, despite not being in the blast radius, my own Codex also fell through with her, which felt less like collateral damage and more like the floor itself had become invested in the fight. We still couldn't quite finish her that turn, meaning I had to end and pray. Thankfully, whether through Saiyan blood or simple poor judgment, she ignored the sectoid and instead attacked my Muton, who parried her melee strike and would have killed her outright if she wasn't immune to melee attacks. She tried to escape, but we chased her down, and by the time the mission ended, the assassin was dead, the lost had been cleared, and the sectoid and Muton were later back on the Avenger drinking together for a second time. Whoever's DNA got spliced with this sectoid was definitely an alcoholic. After that, we put a resistance order into place, reducing all chosen intel gained by 33%, and that mattered a ton because it bought us more time before the Warlock could launch his assault on the Avenger. There was also a wonderfully cursed moment where one of the Vipers was talking to a Codex in a room above another Codex, only for the Viper's tail to clip straight through the floor and land directly in front of the one lying in the bed underneath, which suggested that while the program had made undeniable progress socially, architecturally, it still had some issues. We then ran into the Viper King again during a mission with only one turn left on the objective timer. I was one move away from success, but if I pushed forward too carelessly, the King would grab me, make me fail the mission, and possibly take someone with him. So instead, I gambled the entire thing on moving the sectoid up and putting him in stasis, which required surviving his reaction first. He missed the grab and the stasis landed, helping us complete the objective. After he came out of stasis, a grenade, an acid bomb, and one very well placed Muton shot later finally finished him for good. I'ma make a mean suit of armor out of this guy. Story progression then resumed when we built the Skulljack and immediately used it, with the Spectre defying most known laws of movement by running on air to Skulljack an officer. During the fight that followed though, I used Fuse on our sectoid to finish off a trooper, and without noticing, a civilian was nearby, so the sectoid blew up a civilian alongside the trooper. This tied directly into a growing trend in the run, namely that while the aliens were undeniably saving Earth, they still seemed to regard civilian safety as more of a suggestion than a principle. Back on the Avenger, meanwhile, my officer, Cert, who hasn't managed to form a bond or even like anybody for that matter this whole run, somehow managed to bond with the Andromedon, producing a photo where Cert was leaning awkwardly upward with his arm behind the Andromedon's back, while the Andromedon itself appeared to be T-posing, showing us a useful reminder that social integration inside the squad remained a deeply experimental but growing field. The next mission then gave me a reminder that stability inside the roster was still conditional, because my Muton panicked and threw a grenade at a group of civilians. Up until that point, Xcom had been able to maintain the official position that the alien integration strategy was proceeding normally. Moments like this made that position increasingly difficult to present with live mission footage. Bradford could later be seen exercising on the Avenger, which I chose to interpret as stress management specifically related to his proximity to what just occurred. But to their credit, the squad did get a chance to redeem themselves on the next VIP mission and handled it cleanly, with no civilian casualties this time. Later, in that same mission, an enemy sectoid took cover directly in front of a wall my team was standing behind. We blew up the wall, revealing ourselves, and got a beautiful shot of the sectoid turning to face us with what I can only describe as the body language of someone who had realized he may have been on the wrong side. By the end of mid-game, the shape of the run had changed dramatically. The aliens were not only carrying missions, they were now breaking the rules of how missions were supposed to be solved. The enemy continued making increasingly compelling arguments in favor of internal restructuring, and Xcom, having already invested too much politically and mentally to back out now, had quietly shifted from evaluating the aliens to relying on them.
Mr. Gatt, you've been convicted of over 300 murders. Do you really expect this appeal to work?
I figure with the statute of limitations, it really should be closer to 250.
There's no statute of limitations for murder.
Why the fuck not?
Late game began in much the same spirit because exactly after one decent redemption mission, I immediately gave the aliens access to plasma weaponry, which was a strong vote of confidence in the program and a terrible sign for literally everyone else. The Resistance Order reducing chosen intel also continued buying us time, and that helped a lot because the Warlock remained dangerously close to launching his assault on the Avenger, hovering just one narrow pip away from the full intel for what felt like the entire campaign. We also picked up an order giving Advent units a chance to join us for a mission, and from a structural standpoint confirmed that by this stage the team had done enough to inspire the start of Xcom Chimera Squad. The Warlock eventually got the intel he needed anyways and launched his assault, and the mission ran a total runtime of 2 hours, and I gotta say, it was definitely one of the most difficult ones of this run so far.
Join us, and your world will be spared.
We fortunately survived that whole ordeal, but the Hunter was also getting dangerously close to doing the exact same thing. Meaning, late game had now entered the phase where every unresolved management issue was beginning to arrive at the front door, armed. From there, we moved on to the Advent Forge mission. This is where the game tried to introduce the Sectopod like it's supposed to be a major development. Except by this stage, half of my squad was already carrying blue screen rounds, which meant the reveal landed less like a warning and more like a scheduling error. When Xcom then helpfully spawned another pod behind me as well, we somehow still cleared everything in the same turn. And this did a lot to reinforce the growing sense that the aliens were now operating several difficulty settings ahead of the campaign. We then fought the Hunter, and I discovered that Blood Trail also affects damage over time, making poison, fire, and even acid even more ridiculous together than they already were. He did end up landing a crazy crit on my Codex, dropping it to 4 HP, but once our turn came back around, the rest of the fight went exactly the way most late game fights were now going, extremely bad for him. After collecting the suit, Tigan urgently instructed us to protect it at all costs, which the Codex responded by simply placing it onto the floor like it was setting down groceries. And honestly, this cutscene has always been hilarious to me. I just don't know why us casually placing it on the floor sends me into orbit every time. The mission itself ended without much trouble, and not long after, we actually killed another sectopod and recovered its body. This was important because earlier in the run, I had mentioned that my roster was effectively locked to the starting barracks, with one exception. The sectopod was that exception. And once it became available to build, I made the decision that it would only be allowed on one mission, because otherwise it would no longer feel like a challenge run, and would instead become a guided tour of whatever map we decided to load in. We then found the Hunter's stronghold and went to eliminate him permanently. By this stage of the game, our health pools were large and the aliens scaled so much higher than the humans that normal combat no longer really applied. During the stronghold fight, I stacked poison, fire, and acid on the hunter all at once, leaving him with what looked less like debuffs and more like he had just been injected with a forbidden strand of COVID. He missed our Andromedon despite flanking it, almost certainly because his entire internal condition had been compromised. And while we did kill him quickly, Legend difficulty then forced the usual nonsense with the sarcophagus. Like most things when it comes to this game, I wasn't aware that you only get 3 turns to destroy the sarcophagus on the hardest difficulty. Which makes me wonder, how exactly does anybody play this game on Legend and have what others would describe as fun? The hunter came back at full health, died again, came back a third time with 15 HP, and for reasons known only to him, kept running back to the same corner over and over like he had emotionally imprinted on it. He even sprinted through poison trying to get there. In the end, the Andromedon finished him off with exactly the same effort normally used for smacking away a mosquito. The campaign then revealed that the Elders essentially had space aids and needed... Okay, that line is fucking ridiculous. The campaign then revealed that the Elders essentially had space aids and needed better hosts, which is admittedly one of the less dignified ways for a supreme ruling species to frame its long-term plans. So to learn more, we skulljack a codex, spawning an avatar. But it turns out that all the transhuman ambition in the world still doesn't matter very much when a Viper is physically holding you in place while the rest of the squad shoots you to death. The Warlock was next on the list, but by this stage of the game, his mission was so easy that it barely justified commentary. We did him kinda dirty and simply just moved on. The enemy aliens, apparently offended by this continued pattern of leadership removal, assaulted the ship once again. During this defense, I made a huge mistake by teleporting a codex too aggressively onto the objective and activating basically the entire map. Because the teleport can only be used once per turn, I then had to hunker down behind full cover and pray while every enemy in the region attempted to shoot it. Tactical analysis thankfully meant they only had 1 action each, and being on high ground helped too, but not enough to stop a gatekeeper from landing the most horrific shot that left a codex on 1 HP. The fact that it survived at all felt less like tactics and more like a rare stroke of luck. I then teleported it back out and spent the next hour and 20 minutes fighting my way back to the objective. And after groups and groups of reinforcements, we eventually complete the objective, bringing everything but my sanity and the Psy Zombie back to the Avenger. The Sectopod finally finished building, and this thing was so large I literally couldn't see the full UI anymore. It was absolutely enormous. It had 36 health points, 5 points of armor, and the subtlety of a collapsing apartment complex. I still have no idea how we got this thing onto the Avenger, and based on the camera framing, I don't think the Sky Ranger knew either. We brought it along on an important mission because if I was allowed to use it once, then I was gonna make it count. We also used the Sectopod to delete an Archon at the start of the mission, which felt like a pretty strong opening statement. The chosen assassin then picked exactly the wrong mission to appear on, because we walked up to her and hit her so hard with the Sectopod that we deleted 17 points of health and all of her armor in 1 shot. She then attempted to harbor wave a group of robotic units. This was useful because it demonstrated that even late game, some of the enemies still had not fully adjusted to the concept of machines. Later in that same mission, the Sectopod briefly got stuck on terrain that it absolutely should have been able to step over. And the game solved this immediately by revealing that it apparently had a short-range teleport. If I ever saw a Sectopod traverse space-time to try to get closer to me in a normal campaign, somebody will be hearing from my lawyers. Not long after this revelation, we also removed a gatekeeper with it, confirming that it was probably the most single appropriate mission in the entire run to deploy it. With the funnest mission of the run so far out of the way, only one major problem remained before the finale: the assassin. If she survived, she would appear on the final mission, and that meant we had to kill her permanently. We headed into her chamber, and before her cutscene even fully started, my Andromedon panicked into obsession and shot her. Meaning that by the time her introduction was properly played, she was already visible and on fire. This was a huge advantage because she didn't get to trigger Planewalker on that first hit, allowing us to guarantee our opening shot and then stack her bewildered weakness with a rupture. At this point, one of my Vipers also unlocked an ability called Pinpoint, which immediately became one of the most dangerous abilities in the entire run. Pinpoint fires a precision shot that converts extra aim into critical chance, meaning the more accurate the Viper is, the more likely the attack is to land as a massive critical hit. So instead of functioning like a normal rifle shot, pinpoint gradually turns into something closer to a delete button the longer the campaign goes on. The assassin became so vulnerable so quickly that one of my Vipers hit her with that pinpoint shot for a whopping 42 damage.
Oh my god. Holy moly.
Naturally, we still couldn't destroy the sarcophagus in time, mainly because Legend difficulty remains deeply committed to fairness, so she comes back at full health. The Andromedon also resisted his obsession this time, which is one of the rare moments in the run where improved mental health was actually unhelpful, because it meant she would return invisible and we had to find her ourselves. Thankfully, whether due to lingering trauma from the earlier pinpoint shot or Xcom being nice for once, she moved into a position where my Viper was already flanking her. So we repeated the process, destroyed the sarcophagus, and when she came back one final time, she no longer had enough HP left to matter. That brought us to the Advent Network Tower, and this is the second to last mission of the game. We sent in a Codex, Spectre, and Officer, with my intel management towards the end of the campaign once again being deeply irresponsible. During the mission, we shot an Andromedon off a roof almost immediately, which did a lot to establish the tone for how the rest of the operation was going to go. The objective itself nearly became a problem when I remembered a little too late that the Spectre couldn't actually complete it. So instead, I used a psionic bomb from the Codex together with the Mimic Beacon from the Spectre to inconvenience this pod long enough for the Officer to safely finish the interaction. 2 mechs had gone into Overwatch, making the psionic bomb matter in the first place, and thanks to tactical analysis again, with some careful positioning and a surprisingly amount of late game nonsense, we managed to get out. And with that, we're finally ready for the final mission. Back on the Avenger, Kayla could be seen doing push-ups in the living quarters, and this for me was funny enough on its own to justify her making the cut. We then assembled the final squad, the best of the best, and for the first time in a while, I paused to appreciate something that felt almost sincere. We hadn't killed any civilians in a while, the team had grown, and they had improved. And after everything that had happened throughout the campaign, from defectors to war crimes to accidental objective abuse, it felt strangely fitting that the commander's avatar would be joining them on the field for the last battle. We've been through so much together in the past few months, it only feels right. So going into our final mission, we have Raven the Sectoid with his Sectoid Illyrium skin, overclocked Sectoid Blaster, Sectoid Amp, and blue screen rounds. Grievous the Spectre with Warden Armor, Spectre Plasma Rifle, Mimic Beacon, and Tracer rounds. Hammer the Andromedon with its Illyrium Andromedon suit, Andromedon Rifle, Acidic Weapon System, and Dragon rounds. Kayla the Viper with her powered Viper Armor, overclocked Viper Rifle, and her Viper Tongue. Ghost the Muton with his powered Muton Armor, overclocked Muton Rifle, Bayonet, and Talon rounds. And Cert with his Warden Armor, Advent Plasma Rifle, Hollow Targeter, blue screen rounds, and Mimic Beacon. The final mission opened immediately, throwing one of the largest pods I had seen all game at me, featuring 2 Andromedons and a Gatekeeper. You think the Elders are mad their own aliens are conspiring against them? Regardless, we solved that problem by having my Sectoid land a 50% mind control on the Gatekeeper and permanently adding it to the movement. It was a huge play, and one that felt genuinely earned, because by this point that Sectoid had come a long way from being mind controlled by his own species. The first section went surprisingly well. We cleaned up a mech pod in a single turn, pushed through a group of Faceless and Berserkers, and at one point used Void Rift to mind control a Berserker with 1 HP, which I then marched through acid into another Faceless before accidentally parking my Sectoid next to it under the mistaken impression that the mind control would last longer. It didn't. The acid then killed it at the end of the turn, and that was a useful reminder that even in the final mission, I was still capable of creating my own problems. Things became significantly more serious when we ran into a pod containing 2 sectopods and 2 advanced mechs. At that point, I genuinely felt my cardiovascular system attempting to shut down. I had never seen a pod so vicious before. We stasis one sectopod and ruptured the other, and then hit it with the kind of concentrated anti-armor firepower that you would normally see in a Helldivers 2 fight. A Mimic Beacon, a Dimensional Rift, and a surprisingly fortunate interaction with the stasis timing then allowed us to survive their turn and chunk the second sectopod for 10 free damage as it came out of stasis. Totally intentional, by the way. We eventually cleaned the rest up even after I shot my own Gatekeeper in the mouth and then advanced into the final chamber. We're here and we're wasting no time engaging. The first avatar died pretty clean. We ruptured it, watched it teleport halfway across the room, dragged it back into sight with the Dimensional Rift, and then punished it for the world's stupidest teleport, moving directly in front of Kayla. who simply grabbed it and held it still while the Andromedon finished the job. At that point, I felt pretty good, which is hilarious because it was the last time in the run I would feel anything remotely resembling comfort. What followed was complete deterioration. Multiple pods of sectoids began spawning. One pod unsubscribed from breathing, and Kayla was left poisoning the other cluster completely by herself. And then a new avatar pod appeared right before Kayla got mind controlled. Two of my teammates suffered mental breakdowns from already being tired, and my muton started running laps around the room trying to clear his head. Oh, and I also forgot to move my sectoid, meaning that the Archon landed a missile on him, leaving him at 2 HP. All of this within the span of 3 minutes. The first priority was freeing Kayla, which required putting the commander's avatar out in the open to take a shot because there was simply no other angle. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to get her back. After doing that, we damaged the avatar and then tried to survive another turn under what can only be described as escalating physical pressure. The enemy avatar attempted to mind control my sectoid and failed because Solace made him immune to negative mental effects, which was excellent, but then one enemy muton shot Grievous, another hit him again, and the pod of Codex on the left spent a suspiciously long time dealing with one of my summoned troopers. A fresh pod of Vipers then arrived to make the room even worse, but despite all that, somehow, nobody died. From there, we kept trying to take the avatar down while the room became progressively less stable. We mind controlled an enemy Codex, used Kayla to grab the avatar again to kill it, got another spawn, had the muton shadowbound, had Grievous drop to 1 HP, watched Kayla panic and sprint to the far end of the room, and eventually found ourselves in a situation where the final avatar could not quite be finished because every teleport kept leaving it just out of reach. So to buy one more turn, I put the Andromedon out in the open as a sacrifice, trusting that its absurd armor and second phase would absorb enough violence to keep the run alive. And for a while, it did. One by one, enemies unloaded their guns into him until eventually, one muton had enough, ran up on him, and hit him so hard it knocked him unconscious.
Damn!
An enemy Codex psionic bomb Kayla and my Codex that I mind controlled, emptying their weapons. A Viper poisoned the sectoid that was sitting at 2 HP. The last avatar hit Kayla with a null lance, and my own muton's shadow brought Grievous down to 1 health. At that point, the game started feeling like it had finally remembered it was allowed to kill me. So I reloaded Kayla and prepared for one final turn. And in one of the better examples of Xcom solving a problem it had helped create, the panic she had suffered earlier ended up positioning her perfectly, because the last avatar getting greedy put itself in front of her, and with pinpoint, she was able to deal exactly enough damage to kill it and get the win, ending the run in the process.
Yo, that shit was getting ugly.
So yes, we beat the alien only run, and somehow, despite everything that happened, we did it deathless, because the sectoid that got poisoned who was on 2 HP actually lived. The aliens held the line. The rehabilitation program against every ethical and tactical warning sign available to modern science had succeeded, and after everything that was said and done, I'm proud of the progress this team made. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.